Not gonna lie, I'm kind of nervous uploading this video because I just know if this video appears in the wrong channels, in the wrong internet spaces, I'm gonna have all the angry dude bros in my mentions. So yeah, here's to hoping that my channel is still small enough that this doesn't happen. But anyway, hello everybody, I'm Sarah, and today I'm gonna tell you why fantasy sucks. And no, the title is absolutely not clickbait because I'm gonna be quite harsh. I might not go into depth on everything because if I did, then this video would be very long, but I will try to at least quickly mention most of the problems I see within the fantasy genre. And I'm gonna do that in two parts. First, I want to talk about why fantasy sucks in terms of the contents of the books, and then I also want to talk about why fantasy sucks in terms of the fantasy community. But before we get into those things, I quickly need to talk about why I love fantasy, actually. Because yes, hello, I'm a fantasy reader. I'm an adult high fantasy reader. Which, by the way, I should also mention that while I think to a certain degree this goes for every fantasy genre, and while I think to a certain degree this also goes for science fiction, probably, the things that I say, I am going to talk about the things mainly in a way as it concerns adult high fantasy, because that of course is the subgenre of fantasy that I read the most and that I have the most experience with. Now, why do I love fantasy? I love fantasy for its potential. I mean, of course I love fantasy for the fantastical worlds, for the world building, for the characters, for the magic, for all of that. But aside from all of those things, the reason why I love the fantasy genre is for its potential. And what I mean with that potential is that I think fantasy has a lot of potential taking real world situations, taking real world problems, putting them into a fantasy world and then deconstructing those problems to maybe get behind them. And we've seen that a lot, for example, in R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War series, where she does a lot of work deconstructing colonialism and colonial narrative, which is the part of the Poppy War series that I enjoyed the most. However, I also think that this aspect of fantasy cannot be used to its full potential. And the reason for that is often behind the problems that I want to talk about now. So let's get my first problem with fantasy out of the way, which doesn't really specifically concern the potential of fantasy or the potential that I see behind fantasy, and is a problem that is talked about again and again and again, and that is the useless and absolutely unnecessarily violence towards women in fantasy. I think in terms of harmful misogynistic stereotypes within fantasy, there has been a lot of improvement within the past 20 years. I think we don't get to see as many, for example, damsel in distresses anymore. We see a lot more strong female characters of like multiple different types. We get to see a lot more female characters who have their own agency, who aren't just swept along by the narrative. However, at the same time, there's still this thing where authors for some reason feel the need to subject their female characters to unnecessary, often sexual violence. And by the way, I 100% agree that there's certain books that warrant sexual violence towards women. I will later talk about R.F. Kuang again in terms of sexual violence and bring two examples where I think the violence is positive and where I think it's negative. But a lot of times when especially male authors write about sexual violence towards the women, it's like not to make a point. I mean, it is to make a point, but it's not to make a point in a way where you're like talking about maybe trauma and how characters deal with trauma and so on, but it's to make a point about how evil that character is, or how heroic that character is because they saved the damsel in distress that was just sexually violated, or it's about how like strong this female character is because she can be raped and yet somehow still go away from it without a single shred of trauma. And I'm sorry, but that's just not okay. Sexual violence should not be used to just propel the plot forward. there should be some other reason for sexual violence to be used. And I have some of my favorite books that have a lot of sexual violence towards the characters. The Black Jewels by Anne Bishop, every single character, male and female, or almost every single character, male and female, has had sexual violence enacted towards them. And we take the rest of the series, which takes centuries working through the trauma and still not 100% resolving the trauma. There's centuries after the act of the sexual violence happens that the characters still have to deal with the fallout of having made those experiences. And so in that case, I think absolutely put your sexual violence in your books. I mean, I still understand why a lot of people don't want to read it, especially women don't want to read it, so I think trigger warnings there are important. But don't put sexual violence in your books just as a plot point. And as I said, I wanted to talk about the Poppy War series in that regard. And actually I think the worst cases of sexual violence in that series are like not necessary but warranted. And part of that, of course, is because those scenes quite often are scenes that are taken directly from Chinese history, more specifically, for example, the rape of Nanjing. And so, of course, the rape of the women is used to kind of show how horrifying war is. However, there's also a scene where sexual violence is used purely to make the main character do something stupid. And that scene is in the Dragon Republic in the second book, where one of the Hesperians rapes a peasant girl, I think, so that the main character then like goes into a rage and kills him. And that scene I found absolutely unnecessary because it didn't do anything but just make Rin kill the Hesperian. And I 100% think that R.F. Kuang could have found another way to show how impulsive Rin is and how like impulsively she sometimes acts, rather than using a Hesperian raping a young girl and that turning her into rage. Turning her into rage, that doesn't make sense, but like, you know what I mean. So yeah, that's kind of my first problem with fantasy, this kind of overuse of sexual violence that has become so common, especially with the rise of Grimdark, to the point that it almost has become a trope. And I'm sorry, but we're in 2021. We should really move past the need for things like flashbacks of the first girlfriend of Tyrion Lannister being raped to death just so we can feel sorry for Tyrion and just so we can understand why he hates his family so much. Like, please, moving forward, I won't say no sexual violence in books, but please, like, use it with care. Don't just use it to motivate characters that have nothing to do directly with the sexual violence, or don't just use it to show how evil characters are. And please, definitely don't have your heroes of your stories, be they grimdark or not, be rapists, because, you know, that's not cute. The next few points I just want to mention very quickly because I did talk longer about each of those points in my Let's Talk Culture and Fantasy video, which I will leave linked down below and also up there. And that is the problem, first of all, of historical accuracy within fantasy, which is bullshit, because even what we see as historically accurate isn't even historically accurate, because history has been whitewashed and only written by men. So, like, historical accuracy is bullshit. Can we please do away with this? But also, along the same lines, can we do away with racism and colonialism within fantasy? That would be very nice. And with doing away with colonialism, I do not mean not using fantasy to deconstruct colonialism within fantasy works, which both white authors as well as authors of color have done. For example, in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, there is a colonial narrative. I don't know yet how much I like the colonial narrative. It could still go down the drain. However, it is or has been so far talked about in a way where I'm like interested in seeing how it goes. And then again, I mentioned it already, the deconstruction of colonialism and colonial narrative in the Poppy War series is mwah, chef's kiss, amazing. But yeah, can we please stop having this whole colonial narrative within a lot of fantasy stories where there's almost like, you know, a good race and then a lot of bad races? And then along the same lines with racism, can we please stop stereotyping the evil countries as countries that are based on cultures that are held by people of color, most commonly either Black cultures or Middle Eastern cultures. I mean, I understand to a certain degree where it comes from, but you know, we can move past it. We don't have to do what fantasy has done for 100 years. And that is actually my main problem that I want to talk about in terms of content of fantasy. And that is that somehow no one who reads fantasy, not no one, but like a lot of the fantasy community, authors as well as readers, seemingly don't feel the need to reflect on old tropes within fantasy. And a lot of times those tropes started in a time that wasn't as PC as it is now, whatever you want to call it. A lot of times those tropes come from a time where racism was pretty normalized. And you know, Tolkien, I don't want to get into the discussion, was he racist or was he not? But fact is that his evil human races very much are reminiscent of Middle Eastern as well as African peoples, and fact is also that he based his orcs on the Mongols. So, you know, that's like kind of problematic, not gonna lie. And I love The Lord of the Rings. Once you're gonna watch my best books of 2020 video, you will see that The Return of the King is on there, but that's still a fact of fantasy. That's still a fact of fantasy that a lot of the tropes that we now use are based in racist and racial stereotypes. And I wouldn't say that tropes that we use now that are based on these tropes from back then, on these racist tropes, are now automatically racist. I don't know. I won't get into the discussion now, but I think it still is very much necessary that we reflect on it, that we talk about it, that we think on it. I don't think we should automatically stop having orcs in our fantasy books. I mean, the concept of evil races and so on is kind of past anyway. We don't have that many evil races within fantasy anymore, and a lot of times when they do appear, it's like in Stormlight, where you have the singers, where, you know, they're often just misunderstood and they're their own cultures and they're just the antagonists within the first books, but then you kind of get a change of narrative. Or you have books like The Unspoken Name, I think, which I forgot the author of, where you now have orcs as the main characters and so on. And so I don't think that the concept of evil races necessarily is racist in and of itself and is evil in and of itself, but I do think that it's something that we need to change the framing of, that we need to reflect on, that we need to discuss. And if we don't do that, we can't move forward from that. There isn't really a possibility to just move forward and just ignore that orcs based on Mongols were a thing in fantasy. And I just don't think that the work is done by either not using those tropes anymore or ignoring the fact that those tropes were started with racist stereotypes. I think to move forward within the fantasy genre, to 100% use the potential that fantasy has, we need to look at those tropes, reflect on those tropes, and change the framework of those tropes. And only by doing that we can move forward. However, a lot of people are just too comfortable within those tropes, and it's just like, you know, it's fantasy, it's not that deep, it's not that political, which also was a discussion yesterday on Twitter, which, you know, was one of the reasons why I decided to upload this video now, because, you know, you can read fantasy and not read politics into fantasy. That's completely fine. However, to say fantasy is not political is not correct, because even fun reads like The Kings of the World and Bloody Rose still have politics within them. They might not always be obvious, but they are there. And a lot of the politics within fantasy actually are quite questionable and quite negative, like, you know, the love for imperialism within fantasy, which that's a whole other thing. And also, you know, the love of the right of blood, which, you know, legitimate kings and so on, which actually it's maybe used that to move on towards my problems with the community. And that is that a lot of the last few problems that I talked about that I have with fantasy are there because for some reason the fantasy genre, I say some reason, but I know the reason exactly, and it's exactly because these things exist within fantasy, because these things have existed within fantasy for the past century, that white supremacists absolutely love the fantasy genre, which, you know, isn't that lovely? Isn't that absolutely lovely? And that is actually the second reason why I wanted to make this video now, because I felt like it was very topical in terms of the riots. Was it riots? Was it a coup? I don't know. I don't know the words right now. In terms of the coup attempt in DC. 2 days ago? Was it 2 days ago? I don't know. Time passes by so quickly. Like 1.5 days ago, probably. So, yeah. I actually found a tweet by a German journalist, I think, at least my mom sent it to me, that pointed out how kind of weird it is that a lot of the protesters, a lot of the white supremacists, aside from tattoos connected to white supremacy, also have a lot of tattoos connected to multiple different fantasy fandoms. Mostly computer games, but I think, you know, it's kind of similar things. And the reason for that is that I think fantasy, as I have just said, talking about the content, by the way, I look like I'm smiling, but I'm really just a burning heap of rage inside. I cannot even talk anymore. I'm sorry. But anyway, I think a reason for that is that, as I have just mentioned in a lot of the problems right now, within fantasy there has always been a narrative of a legitimacy of a certain race within fantasy, or a certain people within fantasy, or a certain kingdom within fantasy, where all other kingdoms, peoples and so on were demonized, and it has gotten a lot better. I have to say that it has gotten a lot better, but it's still a fact that it was a part of fantasy for a long time, and to a certain degree still is part of fantasy now. And so using fantasy, it is very easy for white supremacists to also then use that legitimacy of certain people, of certain kingdoms, of certain races, of certain bloodlines within fantasy, and to kind of turn it over onto the real world and kind of see the parallel with the white race and the supremacy of the white race and so on. And Hannah just turned the faucet off. On. Where was I? Yeah, anyway, so it's easy for white supremacists to use the narratives that are perpetuated within fantasy and to put them onto the real world. And you know, I'm not saying it's the fault of fantasy, because, for example, white supremacists are also always using Viking and Germanic aesthetics and narratives for like their own gains, no matter if it has anything to do with the historical ethnic groups of the Vikings, which by the way weren't even just one ethnic group, or the Germans, Germanics, Celts, I don't know, whatever. I hope you know what I mean. So yeah, I don't think it's the fault of fantasy, but I think if we maybe manage to get rid of some of those narratives within fantasy, then maybe some of the white supremacists within the fandoms would end up being butthurt and leave, which, you know, I think would be absolutely amazing. And you know, there are also not that few of those, because again, a few of the big creators within the fantasy booktube genre, I mean, I don't know if it was a few, I know of one that I hadn't heard about before, luckily, but yeah, a few of the creators, or at least one of the creators within the fantasy booktube community, exposed themselves a few days ago by being a Trump supporter. You know, that's just lovely. And then the last point I wanted to talk about, and again, this video is kind of a little bit of a mess because I just wanted to rant, and it's not 100% thought through because I'm way too angry right now to think anything through. But the last thing I wanted to talk about is how, if you're a woman, especially a BIPOC woman, the fantasy community is kind of really a shit place to be. And my battery is almost dead. Isn't that great? I don't think I... Anyway, the internet is a harsh place in general, but I don't know a single Booksternet community that is as misogynistic and racist, but we just talked about the racist part, but as openly misogynistic as the fantasy community. From people openly admitting that they won't read adult high fantasy written by women because women cannot write fantasy. Gesundheit! That was Hannah sneezing. Because women cannot write fantasy, to just going into women's comments telling them that they're wrong. Like, men within the fantasy community are so fucking entitled. And it's actually the reason why I don't even want to be part of the fantasy community. I do not know a single community where I have seen as many tweets saying, like, tweets by women and by women of color saying, I do not want to come to the attention of the fantasy community. I do not want to be part of the fantasy community. Please do not recommend me on threads for fantasy booktubers because I do not want the fucking misogynistic white supremacist fantasy dude bros in my comments. And, you know, I've had a lot of people disagreeing with me on my puppy war video, but it's kind of interesting how women manage to engage with me on an intellectual level and have discussions with me about our opposing views, while most of the men that commented on that video kind of just only call me stupid and call me names, which, you know, is just lovely, but also shows your lack of intellect, so there's that. And yeah, I cannot tell you how much I love the people that, I don't know if they actively see themselves within the fantasy community, but I have met a lot of people on BookTube who read adult high fantasy who are absolutely lovely. But especially the Reddit fantasy community is just, you know, it's a bag of worms. It's a bag of worms that will maybe come into my mentions, maybe not, depending on who sees this video. But yeah, it makes me sad. It makes me really, really sad to see people on Twitter saying that they won't comment on certain booktubers' videos because all the fantasy dude bros are in the comments and they know if they have any opposing views, and even if they don't have any opposing views, no matter what their views are, just because they are women, they aren't valid and they shouldn't read fantasy. Of fucking course, my battery died right before I was able to finish this video. But anyway, I hope I said everything I wanted to say, or at least mention. As I said, I didn't want to go too in depth on a lot of these things because I think the people that know fantasy will know what I'm talking about just by mentioning this stuff. And I also do have an entire series, Let's Talk Culture and Fantasy, where I either already talked about these things or I do plan on talking on these things in future. Like, for example, the heritage of the racist stereotypes within fantasy of evil races. I'm gonna make an entire video on that at some point. I don't know when it will come, if it will even come within the next year, but I'll make it at some point. And so yeah, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. Tell me in the comments down below your thoughts on what I talked about in this video. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month, because contrary to the opinion of the dude bros that, like, aren't the biggest part of the fantasy community, but definitely are the loudest part, there actually are a lot of great women that write great fantasy novels. And yeah, with that said, I hope I'll see you soon, and goodbye.